Hello everybody. Welcome to our next module. In this lecture we're going to be covering stress and the effects of stress on us biologically, psychologically, and socially. So logically, let's start with the basic question of what is stress? I think it's funny that we use the word stress in our everyday language and conversations all the time. So we know on a basic level what that word means. But if an alien beamed down and wanted you to explain to them what that word stress meant, I think we'd have a hard time fully explaining it. That difficulty of clearly defining what stress is something that occurs even for people who are doing tons of research or clinical work in this area. It's a difficult concept to define, and different people have different definitions of it. One of the biggest questions that relates to what is stress is the question of, is stress the stimulus that happens? Is stress the response that someone has? Or is stress the interaction between the two? Let's look at an example of stress as the stimulus or circumstance that happens. Let's say you're a waiter or waitress and you were carrying a huge tray full of food for like a 10-person table, and someone got up as you were walking by and you dropped everything all over the people sitting there. In this example, the stimulus is the person who trips you and the dropping of all the food. So if we were going to define stress as the stimulus, the stress would be that event that happened. But if we were going to define stress as a response, it wouldn't be what happened in the environment, it would be what happens within the person to you as the waiter or waitress in this thought experiment. As a response to that situation. So maybe you'd blush, find your heart starts beating faster, maybe you'd feel an urge to cry, maybe you'd feel an urge to run away, maybe your palms would get sweaty. So some people define stress as the response, not what happens to you, but this internal process that occurs. So when you use language like I feel so stressed, this is most in line with a response conceptualization. But probably the most common way people define stress is as an interaction, or the interface between events or circumstances that happen and the reactions in the mind and body. So from here on out, when I use the word stressor, I'm going to be referring to any event or situation that triggers a need to cope. Stressor is going to be referring to the stimulus, whereas the word stress is going to be used to refer to the process or the interaction by which we perceive and respond to events that are subjectively viewed as harmful, threatening, or challenging. So stress will be viewed as our reactions to something that we perceive has already caused us damage or loss, that will cause us to have a difficulty in the future, or that is going to require us to adapt and cope. Stress refers to both the event and the circumstances that occur, and the way that we subjectively react to them, as well as what happens in our bodies subsequent to that. Delving a little bit deeper into this question of what is stress, it's important to note that there are both acute or short-lived and chronic or long-term stressors. There are also stresses that result in positive outcomes, which we refer to as eustress, which are considered stressful because they do necessitate or require a need for adjustment or coping, but these typically leave you feeling positive emotions, a sense of self-esteem, a sense of accomplishment, or that sort of thing. So something like applying to graduate school or working to get an internship in your field or that sort of thing, those might be considered eustress. Also, those stressors can much more commonly be negative or result in negative feelings and negative outcomes. On the extreme end of that, certainly, we have trauma and neglect. Now, trauma can certainly be acute. It can be relatively short-lived. Perhaps a good example of this might be being robbed on the street. It happens, it's over quickly, so the stressor itself is complete or has run its course in a short period of time. Whereas trauma can also certainly be quite lengthy, such as growing up in abusive households. It's important to realize that we really, as a human race, need some amount of stress to function well. When our arousal level is very low, we're underloaded, undermotivated, and our performance is very low. At moderate levels of stress, there's a rise in productivity and outcomes. But then there's a return back to low performance at very high levels of arousal where we're overloaded and overstressed. So peak performance occurs when we have a moderate level of arousal and stress. Even when it's not necessarily eustress, you could reframe your experience of stress and look at it as motivating you to achieve your best or optimal level of performance, as long as the stress remains manageable. We do often rely on the stress to perform. Of course, if stress continues and becomes chronic, we move beyond our initial reaction of alarm, where we're able to mobilize coping resources effectively, and then into resistance, where we continue to cope, but finally into a phase of exhaustion where the body's resources are just depleted. And so the body is less able to withstand stress, less able to cope, and less able to defend itself against illness and disease. The initial work that focused on the potential for stress to lead to exhaustion was so important in terms of linking stress to physical health outcomes, though it didn't fully account for why some people seem to be stressed all the time, while others don't seem to get upset about hardly anything. Further work, primarily by a researcher named Lazarus, developed the transactional model of stress to account for these individual differences in perception, as well as in coping resources. The main idea of this transactional model is that the experience of stress depends at least as much on how an event is appraised as it does on the specific event itself. So there's a process that's gone through in this model where, when a stressor is encountered, an individual goes through a primary appraisal process of determining if an experience is relevant, and if so, whether it is some kind of threat or poses harm. They then go through a secondary appraisal process where they evaluate their coping resources and determine if they think they'll be able to meet the demands of that challenge. So people may feel that something is very challenging, but feel that they have the resources that they need and thus feel little stress. Others may feel a stressor is not very threatening, while still others may tend to interpret many situations as a threat. This model is helpful in understanding why different people have very different reactions to the same or similar situation. For example, I have no difficulty whatsoever going in and getting dental work. However, I know people who require sedation when they go in for dental work, perhaps related to past negative experience that they've had when they've gotten dental work done. So it's not the situation itself, it's the perception. It also explains why even the same person can respond to quite similar situations differently at different points in time, as our appraisals are really susceptible to differences in our mood, our health status, our motivation, and our vulnerability. So I might be in a great mood and my husband would say something potentially rude to me in that situation, and I don't see it as being stressful. However, if I'm already sad and he says something that's rude, I may have a very different reaction and see it as very stressful. When we consider the types of situations one may encounter that may trigger stress, the focus tends to be on two different types of experiences: major life events and daily hassles. Major life events are the types of events that are argued to be inherently stressful and to require coping efforts for the majority of people who encounter them, such as losing a job or being diagnosed with a terminal illness. While daily hassles are the conditions of daily life that have been deemed as threatening to well-being, such as disliking your appearance, having too much to do, fighting traffic, being responsible for the bills, or having a boss that puts demands on you at the last minute. Major life events are seen as stressful in and of themselves, with additional stress for each additional major event within a certain time period, such as the past year. Daily hassles are seen as not too problematic on their own, but having a cumulative negative effect when many are encountered together. These conceptualizations of stress have sometimes been criticized for subjectivity in terms of what is chosen to be on the list of a stressful experience, and for the major life events scales, where it is rank ordered in terms of the stress it's equated with. In other words, why are some types of experiences put on the list and others not? Why are some listed as being more stressful than others? There's not necessarily a sound empirical basis for these decisions. They've also been criticized for failing to consider individual differences in how people see the same situation. For example, when I became a parent, I was ecstatic. I loved being a mom. I had a very happy pregnancy, and we had a relatively easy adjustment. However, pregnancy, childbirth, and welcoming a newborn is a quite different experience if you're addicted to heroin, for example. I think I'd be very hard-pressed to say that the stress level of having a child is the same for myself versus someone struggling with addiction. While there are criticisms to be made of these measures, there is a decent body of research to back up that the experience of major life events and daily hassles has a reasonable predictive value in looking at health outcomes, with stress adding up the more stressors are encountered. For example, people who've been involved in man-made disasters like the Chernobyl nuclear accident or 3 Mile Island accident have been found to have an increased risk for hypertension and heart disease. Officials who presented and worked following the September 11th terrorist attacks have had an increased risk for heart attack and cancer. When considering daily hassles, children who live near airports have higher blood pressure and higher stress hormone levels than children who live farther away from sources of noise pollution. In addition, role overload, or trying to balance the responsibilities of too many different and competing roles, and job-related stress have been linked to health problems. Interestingly, daily hassles have actually proven to be a better predictor of health problems than major life events, which is surprising to some. In order to be able to understand stress and the impact of stress on the body, we need to understand the systems in our body that stress interacts with. I'm going to start by asking you to watch a relatively brief video that provides you with an overview of the nervous system. I'll also ask you to watch a video from the same series that covers the basics of a brain for a review. Note that the full transcript of both videos are available within YouTube. Now that you reviewed some of the basics of the nervous system and the brain, let's consider how they interact with stress. When faced with a stressful situation, the body's sympathetic nervous system is activated, and we experience a state of fight or flight. So if you run into a shady-looking character while walking home in a dark street late at night, you'll probably find that your heart rate speeds up, you breathe more quickly, and you feel a burst of adrenaline. Your body responds in characteristic ways, such as sort of shutting down the digestive system while getting more blood to your large muscles so that you can either run away or defend yourself effectively, even down to the details that would hopefully prevent you from losing too much blood if you were injured, through less blood flow to your extremities, and metabolizing glucose more quickly so you have a burst of energy. Endorphins, which are our body's natural painkillers, are released to help block pain temporarily, so we can better escape from a difficult situation, even if we end up injured. Even the endocrine system, which produces hormones to help regulate the body, gets involved in the fight or flight response, as adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are sometimes called epinephrine and norepinephrine, are hormones that are inherently tied up with the sympathetic nervous system response. Once we've come through a stressful situation, another system, the HPA system, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical system, comes into play as the delayed response to stress to help restore the body back to its baseline state, back to equilibrium. Here, corticosteroid hormones, primarily cortisol, are released to help reduce inflammation, promote healing, and mobilize energy to sort of recover from any trauma or any injuries that may have been sustained. In most of our human history, the sympathetic nervous system would kick in pretty rarely, would be followed by the HPA system response to help us recover from stress, and then we'd spend most of our time in parasympathetic nervous system activation, where we're in a state of relaxation, conserving energy, digesting food, and experiencing cell growth, maintenance, and repair. Typically, the functioning of the parasympathetic nervous system is nearly opposite to the functioning of the sympathetic nervous system, and for good health, we want to spend most of our time in parasympathetic activation. This pattern of reaction from the sympathetic nervous system, with a response and recovery aided by the HPA axis, probably developed over a very long period of time because it did provide a survival advantage for the types of stressful situations encountered thousands of years ago, like encountering a wild animal. However, it doesn't work particularly well in our current society because the body and the brain are not good at differentiating different types of stressors. Our body in many ways reacts the same to getting a pager call at 1 a.m. as it would if I was encountering a poisonous snake in my front yard. Since the types of stresses that we're encountering in modern life are typically less lethal but much more frequent, the sort of all or nothing response of the sympathetic nervous system means we're in fight or flight response a lot. When stress is encountered infrequently, the body is typically able to maintain an appropriate level of activation, even under changing circumstances. In this case, you encounter a stressor, fight or flight kicks in, the stressor resolves, and you go back to parasympathetic activation. However, especially when people are under chronic stress, as we tend to be in modern day society, the body spends a lot of time in sympathetic nervous system activation and can actually develop a reduced ability to adapt. So even once a stressor is resolved, the body may have difficulty returning back to parasympathetic activation or relaxation. Conversely, when you're in a period of relaxation and a big stressor is encountered, the body may also have difficulty mounting an effective stress reaction to help cope with that. Psychoneuroimmunology is a subfield of health psychology that studies the interaction of psychological, neuroendocrine, and immune processes in stress and illness. Psychoneuroimmunology helps examine some of the biological pathways by which stress can foster disease and illness. For example, chronic exposure to stress can actually damage the receptors for cortisol in the hippocampal region of the brain, such that the brain can no longer accurately receive signals from the adrenal glands to try to restore homeostasis, which means the fight or flight response has a difficult time turning off, and the body doesn't get back to doing things like repairing cells or digesting food. It's also possible that chronic stress exposure can lead to the adrenal glands becoming, quote, exhausted because they've been pumping out so many stress hormones, and then ultimately can't produce hormones as effectively when they're really needed. This dysregulation of cortisol means the body is less able to adapt to changing circumstances. Of course, these direct effects of stress on the body can also be paired with what we call indirect effect of stress, which many argue are equally, if not more important than the direct effects. Here, stress encourages maladaptive behaviors like eating junk food or not exercising or turning to drugs and alcohol that disrupt the way the immune system functions indirectly. Given that these direct and indirect effects are often paired together, we're setting our bodies up to have a very difficult time trying to maintain immunocompetence, or the ability to effectively defend our body against disease through the immune system. To ensure that we're all on the same page about what the immune system is, how it works, and why it's important, I'd like for you to do 2 video clips. Hopefully after watching those videos, if you weren't already incredibly appreciative of this fact before, Our immune systems are essentially what allow us to remain healthy and to function in a world that's filled with things that could make us very ill. However, with chronic stress, our immune systems become compromised and suppressed, making it more difficult to defend against bacteria or viruses we might encounter, or against natural disease processes that are ongoing in the body, but which the immune system can normally effectively take care of. Or it may start to mistakenly see healthy cells of our body as threats and attack them. Stress leaves our body at an increased risk for illness and has been linked to various poor health outcomes, from dementia to arthritis to cardiac problems and asthma. Of course, we all experience some degree of stress in our lives, and we don't all end up with dementia and arthritis and a heart attack and high cholesterol and diabetes and breathing problems. So how do we make sense of the impact of stress on disease and illness in different ways in different people? The most important model of how stress relates to varying health outcomes is the diathesis stress model. The idea behind the diathesis stress model is that an individual's risk for developing any particular disease or illness is determined by the interaction of predisposing factors like family history and stress. The simplest version of the diathesis stress model states that a predisposing factor, which is a long-term, inflexible, rather unchanging factor that places you at higher risk for developing a given condition, and stress must be present for an individual to develop a particular disorder, be that a physical or psychological disorder. In the presence of just one or the other condition, no problems will arise. However, this is a big simplification. For one thing, there are a number of different types of diatheses. There can be biological vulnerabilities to developing certain problems from the genetics passed down to you via your family history. But diatheses can also include stable personality traits like neuroticism, or even social or environmental experiences like long-term neglect from parents. What's interesting, of course, is that many of these diatheses are not yes or no factors, meaning it's not that they are either present or absent, but rather that they exist on a spectrum or continuum with minor gradations present. So it can be hard to determine where to draw the line in asking whether diathesis is present or not. The same is true to stress, of course, in that stress can be present in a little, a medium amount, so really it's not a yes or no variable. In general, it does seem to be true that individuals with higher levels of a given diathesis do experience a given disease or condition at higher rates than those with lower levels of the diathesis, though rates of disease go up in all individuals with any level of diathesis with increasing levels of stress. The impact of stress, however, is more profound in the development of a given problem among those with the highest levels of diathesis. In addition, the threshold level of stress that would be required to produce a disease state can vary depending on the disease in question. It may take very low levels of stress for one diathesis present to develop into illness, whereas other diatheses may require a very high level of distress before the disease would present and develop. So the yes-no model of diathesis and stress is a very significant simplification, but does help us understand why different people may develop different problems related to chronic stress, as the types of diatheses present may vary and may be more or less susceptible to development based on stress exposure. Most people agree that everyone has some sort of a diathesis. While I apparently have the diathesis for diabetes based on a very strong family history of such, the fact that my husband does not have an apparent diathesis for diabetes does not mean he does not have a diathesis for something else. This is why stress management is incredibly important personally and for our society, as the impact of chronic stress exposure will likely strongly and significantly contribute to the to the development of mental or physical health problems for each and every one of us. As a side note, the research seems to suggest that the diathesis stress model applies equally well to both physical and psychological disorders, which is an interesting piece of evidence suggesting that the mind and body are really too entwined to be even considered as separate from one another. Whether we're considering the risk of developing the common cold in response to exposure to the virus, which goes up with higher levels of stress, to a greater likelihood of having a heart attack or stroke or diabetes, all of which have increased risk with higher levels of stress, an underlying diathesis can become active and lead to a disease process and illness when sufficient stress is present. Stress can even make your immune system go on overdrive and attack healthy tissues of your body, which can be lethal. Stress can also promote inflammation in the body, which typically is helpful and helps promote the healing process, but which has been linked to 7 of the top 10 causes of death when too generalized in the body and too frequently present. As stress is becoming more frequent and chronic because of the ways our society is changing, we absolutely must be dealing with this reality for our own well-being, but also thoughtfully considering social policy and impacts if we want humanity on the whole to be healthier and have better quality of life. Before we jump ahead to discuss ways to try to reduce the risk for health or mental health problems due to exposure to chronic stress, I do want to quickly touch on some details about the immune system that I think help illustrate how fascinating it is and how many steps along the way problems could have the potential to develop. First, immunity works on 2 different levels, nonspecific and specific. Nonspecific immunity is our body's general defenses against antigens. You have skin as a barrier to try to keep antigens out. You have immune cells that just float through your circulatory system looking for antigens and then engulfing and digesting them when they're located by chance. We have cells that patrol our body for worn out cells that have broken down or aren't doing what they're supposed to do and break them down. We have cells that destroy problematic antigens or cells with lethal killer chemicals. And we have cells that can release an enzyme to help destroy any microorganisms or antigens that may have invaded if we were injured. These are all non-specific immune responses. We also have specific immunity, which is sometimes called cell-mediated immunity, because it's not happening in the bloodstream the way that non-specific immune responses are. This specific response is for antigens that either somehow elude or avoid that non-specific immune response or that overwhelm non-specific responses. While the non-specific responses can sort of just deal with or attempt to deal with whatever kind of antigen or problem cell they encounter, specific immunity is specific to one particular invader. Some immune cells search out specific antigens and then send a chemical message to other immune cells when they're encountered. These cells, once alerted, seek out those specific antigens only and attack them directly. Then once the job is complete, other immune cells give the all clear message and turn the response off. What's really interesting and important to remember about specific immunity is that an antigen has to be encountered before a specific immune response can be mounted. In other words, if an antigen like a particular virus or bacteria or fungus or something like that has never been encountered by the body before, then it's going to take a while for the specific immunity to kick in, because the helper immune cells have to find that threat and then prompt the other cells of the immune system to perform their various functions. When a particular threat is encountered for the first time, your body is relying just on non-specific immunity, while the specific immune responses are being turned on and produced. Thus, immunity must develop. It has to be created. A baby is typically born with a functioning immune system, but the ability to target specific threats and quickly and specifically deal with them must be acquired through exposure to the threat and essentially the learning of the immune system. That's why my two daughters were sick so often when they started school for the first time. This is also why vaccinations are used, to give your body a head start in producing immunity to a threat that's known to be particularly problematic and preventable. Finally, I think it's also very interesting to think about how our immune system needs to adapt constantly. Viruses are constantly basically editing themselves. Bacteria are constantly mutating. So the things that are threats to our health are constantly adapting, meaning that our immune system constantly needs to adapt as well. Having an immune system that cannot mount an effective response, such as in AIDS, or having an immune response that is overactive, such as in allergies, are both problematic. To further your thinking about this, I'd like you all to listen to this segment from a podcast called This American Life, which is on National Public Radio. If you use this link, it will take you to the episode, which is called Enemy Camp 2010. I'd like you to listen to Act 3, As the Worm Turns, which is about 6.5 minutes long. It's free to stream on your computer, so I'd like you to go listen to that before moving on in this module. The take-home point I'd like you to get from me having you listen to this brief clip from This American Life is that even though the immune system is constantly needing to adapt and deal with new threats, and be able to adjust and create memories and specific immunities for things that hadn't been encountered before, it's also very interesting to think about how our immune systems are tied with our developmental history, our ability to evolve and adapt over time. So the idea is that perhaps by being exposed to certain benign antigens, that this is the only way for our immune system to function at full capacity, especially by regulating our inflammatory responses. Lots of scientists have come to view this idea as being potentially a valid one for further investigation. While our immune system is constantly changing, constantly adapting to a changing world, perhaps it's functioning at its peak capacity only when we're physically tied to things from our evolutionary past as well. I find that idea very, very thought-provoking and hope you do as well. Alright, let's move on to focus on how we can use our understanding of the negative impact of stress on our physical and also our mental health to try to promote health and well-being. Here we focus a great deal on the dynamic process of coping. While this will not be the focus of today's lecture, I also strongly encourage you to begin to think about societal changes or policies that may be helpful in reducing stress, rather than simply considering how to reduce or manage it on the individual level. Coping strategies vary in their approach as well as how effective they are. There are certainly those strategies that can make us feel good or experience relief in the short term, such as heavy alcohol use, that may create new problems or simply perpetuate the initial problems in the long term. There are those strategies that try to actually solve stressors, reduce stressor demands, or increase the resources available to deal with a stressor, which are called problem-focused coping strategies, as well as strategies that focus more on controlling or changing a personal reaction to a stressor, rather than trying to change the situation itself, which are called emotion-focused coping strategies. If I make a new budget or get a part-time job because I'm falling behind in my bills, this is problem-focused coping. If I try to make peace with being in debt, such as from student loans, by making jokes about it and try to identify the ways in which being in debt is allowing me to clarify my personal values when making decisions about money, that would be emotion-focused coping. In general, research suggests that problem-focused coping is, for the most part, more beneficial than emotion-focused coping, especially when you have a choice between the two, when you're facing a problem that can actually be solved or be somehow dealt with an action. However, emotion-focused coping can be incredibly beneficial when you're facing a problem that really can't be solved. For example, if you go through a breakup and the other person makes it clear that they don't want to be with you, you can't really fix that situation, but you can try to work on how you're reacting to it. Of course, the ways in which we differ from one another also have an impact on how we cope with stress. For example, individuals who are more physically healthy at baseline are less vulnerable to stress and subsequent stress-related health problems than those who are of worse health to begin with. In addition, having more material and social resources also aids in coping with stress. Individuals of a lower SES engage in less problem-focused coping, and this is likely because they actually sometimes don't have the tangible resources needed for solving or fixing a problem, no matter how clearly they see what a good solution could be. Effective social support is also very important to coping. Now, what represents effective social support will vary depending on the situation at hand. For example, having a family member help out with cleaning your house and doing laundry may be very helpful support when you've just undergone surgery or had a baby, but may not be that helpful if you've just lost your job. Social support can actually sometimes backfire when it's not wanted, when it's inadequate, when people aren't offering the type of support that's needed, or when too much help is offered. Having social skills is important to coping and can help you elicit companionship from others, as well as communicate effectively with others about the type of social support that would be most helpful to you. While individuals who are angry and hostile receive less support and actually make other people feel more stressed. The ways in which we think about situations also has a huge impact on coping. Individuals who have optimistic expectations for the future and who attribute successes to global, stable, and internal factors, saying things like, "I did well because I'm a smart person who will succeed when I put my mind to it," will experience less stress and better outcomes than those who tend to view the future pessimistically and who attribute failures to these types of internal, global, and stable characteristics or factors. In addition, individuals who see themselves as agents of control in the world, who believe that we make our own decisions and determine our own outcomes, experience healthier behaviors and outcomes than those who feel powerless or perhaps have learned helplessness. In addition, individuals who do tend to view difficulties as challenges that can be faced head-on tend to experience improved health outcomes. Finally, individuals who maintain a sense of gratitude for their life experiences, or those who can use humor to get through difficult situations, tend to cope well. Here I'd like you to view a recent clip of a comedian, Tig Notaro, using humor as a way to cope with breast cancer. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive list of all the known factors that influence one's ability to cope with stress. Interestingly, many of these individual difference factors don't make that much of a difference in outcomes when individuals are at a low level of stress. However, when people are under high levels of stress, you see that the individuals with a greater ability to cope, due to their available resources and internal thought patterns, fare better than others. On the whole, though, I think it's important to recognize that we tend to have the capability to be very resilient, as long as we have a break in stress to cope with and adapt to the changing circumstances and new demands. When we think about the training that you guys are receiving right now in psychology, and think about the types of careers where you might use health psychology knowledge, like being a health psychologist, or even being a nurse, or an occupational therapist, or a teacher, any number of things, one thing we want to think about is how we can use the knowledge about the impact of stress on health to help people. Stress management is a collection of methods that are designed to reduce the impact of stress, and you may help people you're working with to learn or adopt stress management behaviors. For example, you may help people develop a program of becoming more physically active, as exercise promotes weight loss and physical fitness, but also enhances blood flow to the brain, reduces how much your body is physically reactive in the face of stress, and is associated with fewer stress-related health problems. That's in addition to all the psychological benefits, like having higher well-being and less anxiety and depression, which are nearly equivalent to the effects of using an antidepressant. You may also teach people you work with how to use relaxation practices, which promote parasympathetic activation, or the relaxation response. So you get all those nice feelings and outcomes that are associated with being out of fight or flight. Some of the common relaxation strategies would be diaphragmatic breathing, where we engage in deep belly breathing, or progressive muscle relaxation, where we tighten and then relax muscle groups in order to try to promote relaxation. Meditation, where you focus your attention on either one thing or focus your attention on the present moment and try to be openly aware of everything that's happening in the present moment, can also be used. I'd like you to go to this YouTube video and try some progressive muscle relaxation out for yourself. Cognitive behavioral therapies are also used for stress management. This is where you're essentially working with people to help them learn new, more effective ways of thinking and acting. This is based on the assumptions of Lazarus's transactional model that our thoughts are what determine whether a particular event is stressful or not. Here, individuals are helped to view situations less threateningly, if that is indeed warranted, or to recognize ways they're able to exert personal control and cope with the stressor. They can also learn to use things like humor or gratitude to cope. Well, that brings us to the end of this module. As always, let me know if you have questions or concerns, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the next module.